branch, program manager on several major national programs, and an active participant in a large number of national and international committees. He authored or co-authored more than 80 technical publications. He has many awards and honors, include 15 major honors and awards, which include being named an AIAA Fellow in 1998, a few national or NASA Special Achievement Awards, a number of award-winning papers, some awards for his service to AIAA, and a NASA Exceptional Engineering Medal. He has a patent for a thrust augmented spin recovery device. Started his early career in the wind tunnels, where he assisted in the development of the Apollo launch escape system, which after he retired, he was asked to come back to talk to the CEV and CLV group to pass on his Apollo experience. He contributed significantly to the F-111 in low indoor exhaust nozzle performance and integration into the airframe. And he developed Langley's first air-powered twin-engine propulsion simulation capability. His research on the F-15 fighter led to modifications to the aft end, including removal of the ventral vanes, which reduced the cruise drag of the F-15 by about 7%. And he was the author of the 16-foot data reduction package, which anybody who's worked in wind tunnels knows that that's like the Bible for data reduction here at Langley. Conducted pioneering research that led to the development of several innovative exhaust nozzle concepts. Did research in yaw thrust vectoring nozzle concepts. He retired in 2005, but has remained active as a distinguished research associate at NASA, and then in 2008, he began working for ATK and AMA as a contractor in the Revolutionary Aviation Technologies branch. So,
but I'm Bobby Berrier, and I'm a tunnel jobber, and I'm proud of it. I also have another title that I'm proud of. After they decided to close the tunnel, the 16-foot tunnel, and did close it, I mentioned that one of my supervisors that one of the things, nicely say this, one of the things that really irritated me is having spent my life in that facility, I was not consulted on shutting it down. And they asked me, they said, you know why you weren't asked? I said, no, I don't. They said, because you're considered a tunnel hugger. So that's another title that I'm proud of. I'm a tunnel hugging tunnel jobber. Courtney's right, I spent a lot of time 16-foot tunnel. Although I'm too young to come 1963, I think. I'm not sure about that. The picture you're looking at is probably one of the most utilized photographs in the NASA archives. It's used on some book covers I'm aware of. One of the books is Engineer in Charge. I highly recommend that. It's an oxymoron now. It's on advertisements. AIAA magazine regularly carries that photograph, so that's the reason I selected that particular photograph. So hopefully this works. Here's an outline. What I plan on covering is the history of the physical plant. 3 periods from the time it was built up to the first major rehab, and then a middle period leading up to another major rehab, and then I'll cover some of the history of the work. Aeronautics, I've broken it in 3 groups. Aeronautics, and that's basically airplanes because space also includes aeronautics. But when I say aeronautics here, I'm talking about airplanes. Space, and then some of the technologies developed. So we'll first cover the first period when the tunnel was built to the first major rehab. Anybody want to take a guess how long it took to build the 16-foot tunnel?
2 years.
2 years.
10 months.
10 months. Optimistic 10 months. Okay. No guesses. 16 foot was really built under clouds of war, so that's the title, why the reason I have clouds of war there. Charles Lindbergh was on the NACA committee, and he took a trip to Germany. While in Germany, he wrote a letter back to the NACA committee, and he said in that letter that he was incapable of conveying the extent of German aeronautical development in a letter. He just couldn't put it in a letter. He also said that Germany was far ahead of the United States in military aviation. 2 months later, 2 months, people that make decisions, 2 months, December 1938, NACA recommended construction of new facilities at Langley Field in which special problems of military aircraft could be investigated. Those facilities were the Structures Lab, which was the first building on the west side of the field, a 20-foot tunnel to study spinning, a 7 by 10-foot high-speed tunnel to study stability and control problems, and a 16-foot diameter high-speed tunnel to study the cowling and cooling of full-scale engines and propellers. And 16-foot more or less has stayed true to that charter through its entire life, working propulsion. I used to get a lot of questions, why you guys work in propulsion? It comes from that original work. That committee also recommended a new center at Moffett Field in California, which we all know wound up being the Ames Research Center. I tried to connect this a little bit to the last question lecture. This is a photograph of the 1938 National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Everybody's here except Lindbergh and Hap Arnold. Hap Arnold was on the committee. But the guy in the circle right there is Orville Wright. So he was in on the decision to recommend building the 16-foot tunnel. So there's a connection to the talk. All right, in 1939, the War Department grants land on the west side. Everything up to that point had been over on the east side of Langley Field to NACA. And in 1939, the funds for 16-foot high-speed tunnel was authorized. September 39, Germany invades Poland. And in June of 1940, the site for the 16-foot high-speed tunnel is prepared. So this is what they were going to build. It's an artist sketch up the top. Included two 8,000 horsepower motors, so a total of 16,000 horsepower. A round, solid test section, and an air exchange tower, where about 20% of the air on each circuit around the tunnel would be scooped off the periphery and was exhausted straight out the top, and then fresh, cool air was brought in from the outside, and that served two purposes. One was to keep the tunnel cool, or cooler. We still would get temperature on them sometimes. And the other reason was to scavenge exhaust gases off of these full-scale engines that they were going to run. And that feature remained a part of 16-foot tunnel for the rest of its life. So here in June 1940, they're starting site preparations for the tunnel. 3 months later, that's what it looked like. 7 months, you can see two ends of it in this aerial view. This is the Structures Lab. That was the first building on the west side of the field. 16-foot tunnel was the first wind tunnel facility on the west side of the field. After 8 months, after 10 months, and these are kind of close together, but I wanted to show how this thing was built. I didn't do it. You don't see any cement trucks. You don't see any conveyor belts. You see these guys with wheelbars. That's how they built 16-foot tunnel. Anybody here from the safety office? I want to know where the handrails are on this thing. After 15 months, that's what it looked like. And finally went operational on November 13, 1941, 17 months to build the facility. This is what the facility looked in the time period from 1941 to 1950. This is the fan blades. Its first test was December 5th, 1941, 2 days before Pearl Harbor. Cost was a little bit less than $1.5 million. It had a 16-foot diameter closed throat test section. I've already mentioned the 8,000 horsepower motors. And its speed range for the high-speed tunnel was 0.1 to 0.7 Mach number. That carries us to our first major rehab, and if you look at this photograph up at the top, you can see something going over here on the end. That's part of the rehab that was started. So first major rehab, in 1947, there was a new drive system authorized, and then in 1948, a slotted test section was authorized, and it was a year apart because the technology for slotted test section really came about, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, came about after the drive system was authorized, and since they were already going to do the drive system, the 16-foot became a logical tunnel to do slotted walls in. And in the period from 1950 to 61, and I don't know if this was the official name, but I've seen it in several places. I do know they didn't call it the high-speed tunnel anymore, but I've seen just plain old 16-foot tunnel in several sources, so that may have been its name from 1950 to 1961. This shows the major components of that first major rehab. This is a new motor house. It's going to house some new motors and new fan blades shown down here. And that's what you saw being constructed on the end of that previous photograph. A drive control building on the opposite side of the tunnel. And this is starting to take shape as an octagonal test section with a slot in each corner. So that was the first major rehab. This rehab took 23 months as opposed to 17 months to build the whole facility to start with. So we're starting to go downhill already. And this is what the tunnel looked like in that period. Now the fan blades and the motors are located at this end, moved around from here. We still have the air exchange tower, and there was a octagonal slotted test section where the models were tested. It had an equivalent diameter of 16 foot, so that's still a 16-foot tunnel. The motors were 30,000 horsepower, so we went from 16,000 horsepower to 60,000 horsepower total. And the speed range went up to 1.08 now. And that brings us to the last major rehab, which included it basically consisted of a compressor for boundary suction was added. And from 1961 until tunnel shut down, then the official name of the tunnel was the 16-foot Transonic Tunnel. This compressor for boundary suction, a plenum was built around the test section, and then basically a huge vacuum cleaner was attached to that plenum, and it sucked boundary off the tunnel walls. And this is a couple of photographs showing that compressor, a couple of people involved, so you can see the size. I actually have one of these blades. Not I personally, it's still NASA property. It's out of NASA. But I say one of those blades. One of those blades, I'd say, weighs at least 25 or 30 pounds. I cannot imagine this thing rotating at centrifugal force it had. It lasted until we shut down. But 4.5% of the tunnel mass flow was removed through those wall slots when the compressors run. We only ran the compressor to go supersonic.
What was the pressure ratio of the compressor?
That I can't answer. It's probably on the nameplate. I also went in and screwed the nameplate off with it. But the speed now went from 0.2 up to 1.3, and that was the speed range that we covered for the rest of the tunnel life. Might also mention that the compressor also was used to suck bound air off 7 by 10 foot tunnel. So they built a big pipe that went from 16-foot compressor building all the way down next to the street over to 7 to 10, and so they had to schedule with us to make sure we weren't using it when they wanted to use it. So it had multiple purpose. So this is what the tunnel finally looked like, and this is a couple of years after it closed down. You see empty parking lot over here. The compressor building was built in the center here, so that's where that compressor was located. Might point out over here is building 1234. That's where we had a static testing where we did a lot of nozzle testing. I'll have a few more words to say about that later. Anyhow, when we were at top speed, 1.3 Mach minute, we had around 100,000 horsepower online. That compressor was 60. We used 86 megawatts of power. Generally, the field bought like 120 megawatts. The field load, meaning electric lights, air conditioning, that kind of stuff, that used up about 16 megawatts. So if we ran top power during the day and you subtract the field load off, it left about 18 megawatts for everybody else on the field. And we used to have some battles with Unitary. They were another big power user. But our major running shift turned out to be what was a graveyard shift, midnight to 8 in the morning. So I pulled a lot of graveyard shift. Sometimes we ran 3 shifts actually. We had 2 counter-rotating 34-foot diameter blades that rotated at 372 RPM at top speed. And there's only one word to describe being there when we were running 1.3. It was just awesome. You didn't just hear it, you felt it. And some people call that noise. I call that music. I don't expect you to read this, but this is the history part of what went on in the tunnel. And after the meeting, I have booklets that you can pick up. I know some of you already have one, but I have booklets that will cover a lot of stuff that's in this next part of the talk. And what I did, and this poster, by the way, it's a big double poster, hangs in the hall in the old office building at 16 foot. So that's there. It's a 63-year snapshot, and I selected what I consider to be the most significant aeronautics or airplanes, space, and technologies developed in the facility. Now, other people can argue, a lot of people argue the F-14 over the F-15, for example. There's no right answer. These are what I selected. You can select what you want. So come up and pick up one of these books if you don't already have one after the meeting. These are the projects I selected for airplanes. And the ones in red are the ones that I'll have a little bit more to say. I can't cover all these in the time for this particular talk. But starts off with the Douglas A-26 Invader, B-36 Peacemaker, the Bell X-1, the Hawker P-1127, General Dynamics F-111, McDonnell Douglas F-15, the Northrop Grumman D-2, the NASA F-18 Hard, Boeing X-45A, and the Lockheed C-5M Super Galaxy. So I'll have a few more words to say about the ones in red. And I'll say why I think they're significant. This I picked because it was the first test in the facility. And so it was in December, started December 5th, 1941. It was a Douglas XA. X just means it was experimental at the time. Once it became a production airplane, it became the A-26 Invader. So I'll show you a picture of what the whole airplane looks like there. We have a full-scale, this is full-scale engine, full-scale propeller, and a section of the wing. So a section of the wing bisects the tunnel, and then you have the engine and propeller there. The purpose of this test was to study engine cooling and exhaust. A lot of the air-cooled, probably the water-cooled engines as well, had terrible heating problems during the Second World War. So a lot of work went on with engine cooling and exhaust systems. The airplane went on. It was a light-of-take bomber. It served in World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and Bay of Pigs. So it had a long service life afterwards. The guy standing here next to the propeller, name is Dave Bierman, and he was the co-designer of the 16-foot high-speed tunnel along with Lindsey Turner. Mentioned a few obituaries that's occurred with people I know recently. But it turned out that in the obituaries in December, Lindsey Turner's wife just died in December, so she was still alive and living locally. She was the chief what they call it. She was chief of the computing section at 16 foot, and we called them computers. The ladies were called computers, so we had the first computers. Dave was also the first section head 16 foot, and that's equivalent to branch head when I was branch head, at least. I'm not sure what they call it. So he was the first head of the facility. Another tie-in to the Wright brothers, Dave left NACA in 1945, and he became the general manager of the Hartselle Propeller Company. The Hartselle Propeller Company is the only company that was started in response to a request of the Wright brothers. Wright brothers contracted them to build propellers for their airplanes, and they're the only company that's still in existence now that has that relationship with the Wright brothers. We had our 50th anniversary of the tunnel, and Dave Berrier and his wife drove down for that anniversary all the way from Ohio. So once in the family, always in the family. General Dynamics F-111 aardvark. There's several reasons why I selected this one. First of all, it was the first variable sweep wing production aircraft. There was some experimental aircraft, but this was the first production variable sweep wing aircraft. It was also, in my opinion, other than full-scale engines, the most complex subscale model test that we ever tested. It had variable sweep. It had 3 flows in the nozzle. We used hydrogen peroxide for the primary flow. It had a high-pressure air system for secondary flow. It had a low-pressure bandolier bleed system. The blow-in doors on the nozzle actually operated aerodynamic control. The flaps on the nozzle floated with aero loads. Technicians set out in the shop with jeweler's rouge, put between those flaps on that model, and just sit there and open and close them for hours to get all that stuff worked in so they operated smoothly. A little bit about hydrogen peroxide, because it's going to come up later. We used liquid hydrogen peroxide, piped it in as a liquid through the support system, up through the hockey stick, into the model. As a liquid, it was 90% hydrogen peroxide, the stuff that people used to use on their hair. We had these lovely yellow streaks in our hair when I was a kid. This is 3%, so that's what you use to bleach hair with. If you go to the drugstore, that's what you get. This was 90% stuff. And it entered the model, and we had a catalyst pack, or multiple catalyst packs in some instances, that consisted of silver screens, just like the window screen, except it's made out of pure silver. We had cabinets of pure silver. And you cut these out the same diameter of pipe, and you just pack them into the pipe, put ends on it, and you pass the liquid hydrogen peroxide into that catalyst pack. Coming out the other end was oxygen and superheated steam at about 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. So it decomposed into O and H2O. Hydrogen peroxide turned out is 16-foot pioneered the use of hydrogen peroxide for exhaust simulation. But it had its problems. It was incompatible with most materials. Pure aluminum was okay. Some stainless steels was okay. If we bought a valve to put in the system, we had to put it into a bucket of peroxide and sit there and see if it bubbled. If it started bubbling, then you knew you couldn't use that valve. You had to find something else. If hydrogen peroxide at that concentration touches dirt, grease, instant fire. So it had some problems with it, but it worked well, and it simulated a dry power engine very good, very well. Probably one of the best simulators. Another reason why I picked this one is also the most tested. We had 19 entries from 1963 to 1968, 581 occupancy days. General Dynamics rented an apartment for their technicians to live in for a year or two during this time period. It was cheaper to do that than to pay every time they came in. I mentioned hydrogen peroxide, and this is some hydrogen peroxide operations. Can anybody tell me who the technicians are? Actually, the only 2 technicians there are 2 guys here in silver suits. I don't know why theirs was silver. Everybody else is an engineer. We actually worked. I actually went to the railroad siding with suits on. Fire department went with us. to unload hydrogen peroxide off a tank car sitting on the railroad side. My original branch head, Blake Corson is there. Original assistant branch head, Jack Runkle. Ed Lee's here on the end. His name will come up again in a minute. Bo Montgomery, he loved to play mock poker. We used to come in an hour before graveyard shifts started, and we played mock poker for an hour before the shift started. This guy here, John Swire, became vice president of Boeing. So, vice president, I gave John a copy of this photograph after he became vice president of Boeing. Did I mention that hydrogen peroxide was incompatible with most materials? Grumman F-11 Tiger before a leak. Grumman F-11 Tiger after a leak. Did I mention that dirt and grease would cause fires? This is Ed Lee's pants. We had a trench. I mentioned we had to put valves in the bucket of peroxide to see if they bubbled. And you notice this turned over? Ed Lee was coming down this ladder here, hit the bucket, turned it over, caught his pants on fire. His shoe. We had pool change, we had showers all around the tunnel, out at building 1234, and if something like that happened, you ran over one of those showers and yanked the chain, and you took a shower on the spot. Next airplane is a Grumman B-2 Spirit. Picked this one as the first strategic bomber with low observable technology. We had 6 entries between 1980 and 1983. First flight of the airplane was 1989, so we were in right at the, kind of at the beginning of that project. The reason I'm showing an actual airplane in this case rather than a model is because the security classification, when it came in, the security was so tight. When the company left, they took everything. They took data, they took plots, they took hard drives, they took photographs. There's not a photograph in the 16-foot photo files of the model or models that we tested. We had a guard 24/7 on the thing. Every piece of paper that was generated in that project got a number put on it and was logged into a logbook. The first model we tested was delivered by C-130, landed over in the middle of the night, Air Force Base. It was supposed to taxi over to the NASA hangar, where we were waiting with a forklift to unload the model. So the C-130 came in. Somebody forgot to tell the Air Force ground controller that they were supposed to taxi over to the NASA hangar. So he refused to give the airplane permission to taxi over to the NASA hangar. We drove the forklift around to the end of the runway and unloaded the model at the end of the runway. The model was taken out to 1234, the jet exit facility, where it was built up. And when we moved it in the tunnel, it was moved in the middle of the night. We knew, well, I didn't know, but the security people knew when Russian satellites were passing overhead, so we had a window when we couldn't move it in the middle of the night. There were fake tails put on it, and it was covered up with a blanket. And so the symbol model was moved from the building 1234 over into the tunnel. Space projects. Everybody thinks tunnels don't do space. Well, we did space. Ones I picked as most significant is the Boeing X-20 Dinosaur, Saturn Apollo, which was the first test I worked on when I came to 16-foot line. Space Shuttle, NASA Aerospace Plane, or the National Aerospace Plane, and X-Space Planes. And I didn't, obviously, the most significant space projects are Saturn, Apollo, and Space Shuttle, but everybody knows about those, so I picked some of the others to talk about. Boeing X-20 Dinosaur was an Air Force project, and it basically the same purpose as the shuttle. It was to carry people into space and fly them back and land like an airplane. So it was a U.S. Air Force program. The program was canceled in 1963, and I think it was probably canceled because there was a fight between NASA and the Air Force over space, who was going to be the primary players there. And I think NASA won that first round, and so the Air Force canceled this program. And of course, NASA eventually got to the shuttle. This particular model, you can see the scale up here. That scale is about 2.5 inches long. It's much smaller than most models that were tested in 16 foot. And it was probably this small because they used the same model to go to Unitary Tunnel, say, and run, which is a much smaller facility, and be able to run the same model in large facilities and small facilities. National Aerospace Plane, some people took issue that this wasn't really a space project, but kind of spacey to me anyhow. It was a program started by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, in a program called Copper Canyon, and the purpose was to develop single-staged orbit spacecraft. We had 6 Copper Canyon entries between 1984 and 1993. And the model shown here on the left is one of the early Copper Canyon configurations. It had 24 scramjets around the whole perimeter of a cone, and the aft end was actually a truncated cone. Each one of those little engines had to be balanced, not remotely, but had to go in and tweak to get, because you wanted all those engines flowing the same when you tested. What made this significant to me is this is Reagan's. If you remember, he made a big announcement. This is Reagan's Orient Express. And it's supposed to fly to Tokyo in 2 hours, cruising at Mach 25 with passengers. Well, I've had one of the structure people tell me that if they got there in 2 hours, they'd probably have to sit on the airplane another 2 hours to let the structure cool off before the passengers could get off. The configuration shown over here on the right is one of the last configurations. It was designated X-30, and the program really, technically, was far beyond what we could do, to be honest. That's my opinion. Other people would dispute that. We did a lot of good work in it, particularly material structure people. But it was canceled in 1993. It's just a lot of problems to overcome. It was never going to be a passenger airplane. X-space planes. I picked this one because from 1996 to 2004, 13% of the test time was devoted to reusable space planes in 16-foot tunnel. That's a lot of test time over that time period, 13%. Before 1996, which this 13% doesn't cover, we tested X-20, X-24, and the shuttle. So those were kind of space planes as well. But from 1996 to 2004, we had 6 entries X-33, 2 entries X-34, 4 entries X-38, X-40, 9 entries on the X-43, an entry on the next generation launch technology, and 3 entries on the orbital space plane, or the X-37. The X-37 was turned over to the Air Force, and they just put their 3rd vehicle in orbit just right before Christmas of this year. Those were classified missions. We don't know what they're doing, but they're using that vehicle. Right, the last category is technologies. What kind of technology were developed in the tunnel? And these, rather than having specific test dates, in general cover years, and in one case, like propulsion airframe integration, from 1941 to 2004, from start to finish. We did that work. But these are some of the major technologies that worked on: engine cooling, exhaust, and propeller design, development of the slotted wall transonic tunnel, variable sweep wing, propulsion airframe integration. If propulsion airframe integration was the meat and potatoes, non-axial nozzles, thrust vectoring was the filet mignon and lobster. So that's, and then inlet developed. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the items in red. Engine cooling, exhaust, and propeller design was done primarily, well, not primarily, covered the years from 1941 to 1953, the last engine test in the tunnel. Well, that's not totally true. We actually tested a J85 jet engine in the tunnel after I got there on a tip turbine fan, driving the tip turbine fan. This is the Curtiss XSC-1 Seahawk engine, and I'm showing as opposed to all my other photographs that show models in the tunnel. I'm showing one being tested outside. Just a reminder that we always had some kind of static test facility where we conducted tests with no external flow. Miles of internal performance. A lot of that was conducted out building 1234, the jet exit building. Just as another reminder, at one point, 16-foot tunnel also had the 4x4 supersonic pressure tunnel. So we had a large test complex at one time. The 4x4 supersonic pressure tunnel was tore down, and NTF used some of the foundations and I don't know, maybe part of the building and stuff like that. So that's where the NTF is currently built. Before NTF, we had the 4x4 supersonic pressure tunnel there. So you know what the Curtis XSC-1 is. That's the airplane. And if you've seen battleships with airplanes sitting back on the fantail, this is the airplane. They were catapulted off in some cases. Some cases they used a crane. They would lift them over the water and they'd take off. They would land and they use a crane to take them back up and send them back. So they were used as scouts for battleships. Drones are used today. These are the drones, and then except they had a pilot in them. Slotted wall Transonic Tunnel building from 1947 to 1951. This is what the test section looked like when I came in 1963. And the test section was still classified confidential when I came to work. Maybe 2 years after I came to work, they declassified it. So these are the slot test section. These are the slots that I talked about. You can see in each corner of this tag on. And I've got to go through a little bit of explanation about why slotted wind tunnels are important. So forgive me to some of the spouses, but I've got to get in a little bit of technical stuff. The problem with the closed throat wind tunnels, which all of them were up to that point, was they had two limiting problems. By the way, transonic flow are flows that have both subsonic and supersonic flow regimes in the flow, and there's no precise definition of what speed that is, but it's around Mach 1, right at the speed of sound. So closed throat wind tunnels had two limited problems. One was wall interference effects, and the other was tunnel choking. If you can imagine taking these walls off, you can see what the flow looked like going around the wing section. So you can imagine if now you put a tunnel around that, represented by these lines, you're now cutting off some of that natural expansion around the airfoil, and you're altering the flow around that wing. So you don't get the real answer. You have wall interference effects. As speed increases, as you approach Mach 1, it becomes worse and worse and worse. The other problem they have is tunnel choking. They could get up right close to Mach 1 and the tunnel would choke, and they could just put more and more and more and more and more power to the motors, and it wouldn't drive through. You couldn't get any faster. So those two problems became acute as Mach 1 was approached, and that's where the, quote, sound barrier comes from. That's the sound barrier. So starting in the early 1940s, there was intensive efforts, and some might even say there were frantic efforts, because the speed of airplanes were getting faster and faster. Now all of a sudden we're getting regimes we can't test anymore. So there's frantic effort to find a solution to these problems. And I've listed some of them here. They mounted little wing sections on top of a fighter wing and put the fighter into a dive, and the flow over the wing, of course, went supersonic, so they could get some supersonic data. But you got this little bitty wing. You don't have very much instrumentation in it. They used drop models, rockets. That was the start of Wallops Island over on the eastern shore. That's why Wallops Island started. A group from Langley went over and fired rockets with models on top. They proposed and built supersonic research aircraft, the 558 and the X-1, for example. They reduced model sizes. They found that the choke Mach number increased from 0.8 up to 0.95 by reducing the blockage ratio, the ratio of the model cross-section area to the tunnel cross-section area, to a value of 0.001 to then the models got so small, you got other problems, like Reynolds number, for example, was way off. They looked at new model support systems. When they first started testing, they had this big old post underneath the models, one holding each wing and one holding the tail up in the back, and they had balances under each one of those posts. Well, they found that they could reduce the blockage by changing to a sting, for example. So that's where your stings came from for model testing. An angular wind tunnel. Basically, it's just a model of a big old rotating arm. It just rolled around. That was actually built and ran in building 1234, the jet exit facility. Before it was tore down, you could see where they had blocked the ends off where the tunnel came out each end. As you can imagine, trying to get instrumentation and readings and all that kind of stuff off of something like that was another nightmare. Transonic bump. They put a transonic bump in a 7 by 10 foot tunnel. And it's the same concept as the airplane wing. The flow goes faster over the wing, it goes faster over that bump, and they would mount a little semi-span model on that bump to get supersonic speeds. And finally, the partially open or slotted wall came about. Some of the key players in that development: John Stack, chief of the Compressibility Research Division. They said when he cursed, you could hear him at the other end of the hall. He was a very rough man, and he got things done. I guess is what it is. John Becker, he ran the 8-foot high-speed tunnel for a while, and then he came over to 16-foot high-speed tunnels, a section head, which again is equivalent to a branch head today. Ray Wright was a physicist. Vernon Ward is a 16-foot high-speed tunnel project engineer. And then Antonio Ferri, an Italian aeronautical theorist, and Adolf Bussmann, a German aeronautical theorist. These two guys came over here, Project Paperclip. After World War II, the Army went over to grab scientists in Germany and Italy before the Russians grabbed them. So these two guys came over during that time period. They say that it was very hard to understand Antonio Ferri. When he talked about subsonic or supersonic, they both came out supersonic. So you have to be very careful about what he was talking about. All right, in 1946, Ray Wright proposed slotted walls as a way to minimize wall interference. And he was really not looking at this as a way to develop a transonic tunnel. He was mainly interested in reducing wall interference. So he came in and proposed that as a way to minimize wall interference. So in 1947, the 16-foot high-speed tunnel people set up a team under Vernon Ward to initiate tests in a parasite tunnel. And this is a photograph of the parasite tunnel. It was located at 16 foot. This end was attached to the low pressure section in the tunnel. And this end is open atmospheric, which is higher pressure. So when the tunnel was open, the flow just flowed from this end to that end. And so they decided to put a slotted test section in this end of that parasite wind tunnel to see how it worked. The first test runs, the slotted tunnel achieved a maximum speed before choking of 0.97. That was way beyond anything that's been done yet. One of the engineers, there's some disagreement over who, wondered what would happen. You can't do this today, by the way, because you got to have a test plan planned out and then do it and not deviate from it. But anyhow, one of the engineers wondered what would happen if he just took the model out of the tunnel and cranked the power up. And lo and behold, it went transonic, supersonic, no problems at all. This excited everybody, and especially John Stack. I mean, he got really excited about this. So in July and September of 1947, the results from this parasite wind tunnel test was reported to Langley's General Aerodynamics Committee. They had a committee where people would come in and give a presentation on their technical results to the supervisors. And decisions were made out of that. In the July meeting, there was a very strong current of disbelief by people like Bussmann and Antonio Ferri. they stated that any claim of valid data in Mach 1 for sizable models was absurd. That was their position. So in a September meeting, Stack didn't attend the July meeting this year, as I can tell. In September, Stack heard about what went on in the July meeting. So he came in to the September meeting. He set a table, glaring, as it's put in the book I read, glaring at the disbelievers. And finally says, after Bushman and them said, you can't get data at Mach 1. You can't get data at Mach 1. He finally said, okay, I get your point. So there's a unique situation exactly at Mach 1. We'll make this thing work at Mach 0.995. We'll make it work at Mach 1.005. And we won't give a damn about that little thing in the middle. He was partly right. Turns out that even with a big tunnel like 16 foot and a reasonable size model, we rarely tested above 0.95 because of wall interference. You still have wall interference even if you have a slotted tunnel. The other problem above Mach 1, you get a shock wave forming at the nose. It's like billiards. Shock wave goes up, reflects off the wall, comes back down. If it hits the model, your data's bad. So for about a 6 foot long model, which is typical for a 16 foot model, we couldn't test. We generally didn't pick up testing again about Mach 1.15. So there's somewhat larger area in there that we couldn't test, but Stack pressed on. 4 months later, people, 4 months later, Langley submitted a formal description and justification for slotted test section prepared by a member of 16-foot high-speed staff, and work was initiated at 16-foot tunnel. In the spring of 1948, Stack announced that Langley, that the test section of the 8-foot high-speed tunnel would also be converted to a slotted configuration. And not only that, since it would be cheaper and go faster, he gave them priority in the shops on getting stuff done. But there was still a race on between now 8-foot and 16-foot tunnel over who would have the first transonic wind tunnel. They classified all information at confidential level, and that confidential was what still had the test section classified when I went to work in '63. All information was classified at confidential level. They didn't want that getting out. Southern Cal was actually working on something similar, and they managed to get that work stopped. We had an annual inspection at Langley where all the company executives would come in. This was a big to-do. There's some famous photographs of Douglas and all these people that started these companies in at the annual inspection. They told the annual inspection that they were working primarily with the annular wind tunnel concept, and they used that as a subterfuge to keep them from finding out that they were doing this other work at the annual inspection meeting. So in October 1950, the 8-foot tunnel, high-speed tunnel, begins regular transonic operation. But 2 months later, even though we didn't take part in the shops, 16-foot becomes operational with a slotted throat. And in 1951, Stack and Associates won the Collier Trophy for developing the slotted wall. And that's a major award there.
The 8-foot, was that Wickham's tunnel on the
That
east
was
side?
Wickham, so-called Wickham's tunnel, yeah,
Okay.
on the east side. Non-axis metrics are 2D nozzle thrust vectoring. We worked on from 1974 to 1994. 16-foot tunnel led the national effort to develop 2D nozzles and thrust vectoring technologies. The branch initiated a joint workshop, NASA DoD industry workshop in 1974. And the 2D nozzle I'm talking about, this is a normal configuration with round nozzles. This is a 2D wedge type nozzle. At this workshop, we developed a national plan for developing 2D nozzles and thrust vectoring. From 1974 to 1994, we had 75 tunnel entries on either 2D nozzles or thrust vectoring or both. We had a similar number of projects in the jet exit test facility. Some were brought in by David Eames, who's here today from Rolls-Royce, as a matter of fact. The F-15 three-surface configuration was initiated in 1977. I mention that because that eventually became the U.S. Air Force F-15 Stoll and Maneuver Technology Demonstrator, which flew in 1988. And I just took some pictures of some of the models we tested. One of the early ones, this is a wedge nozzle. This is a Boeing configuration, we call it Boeing Super Cruiser. This is a YF-17 with 2D nozzles. And this is the F-15 with two-dimensional CD nozzles with thrust vectoring capability and a canard added up front. That particular configuration came out of our branch. We led a contract to McDonnell Douglas. We told them it had to include thrust vectoring nozzles. It had to include a canard to trim thrust vectoring forces at the front end. We were in favor of taking horizontal tails off, but the McDonnell Douglas talked us out of that, so it became a three-surface configuration: canards, wings, horizontal tails. So that is a NASA configuration. Here's the Air Force F-15 Stoll Maneuver Technology Demonstrator. Canards, wing, horizontal tails, 2D thrust vector nozzles. What's wrong with this picture? Over here's their patch. I don't see NASA on this thing anywhere. It pisses me off to this day. And I asked the question, should this be on the list? I found 2 books that says that the atomic bombs were tested in the 16-foot tunnel. I cannot find any record. The tunnel logs are missing from that time period and probably wouldn't tell you anything if you could find them. The B-2 test in the tunnel logs, those are listed as pressure model 1, pressure model 2, and pressure model 3. I went back and made some notes so future generations can know what those were. But I had no photographs. Again, not surprised. I mean, Norfolk took all the B-2 photographs away. So was that tested in 16-foot tunnel? I don't know. But like I say, several books, one by Don Bales, said that they tested the atomic bomb in 16-foot tunnel. Now, this is the way the facility looked in October of 2010. And I took these pictures over by the racetrack. Gone. Only other thing I've got is I highly recommend, if you're interested in history, I've got about 20 copies of these. Are some of the books that are extremely interesting reading to me. Some of them written by people that I know, work with. Don Bales, my original assistant division chief. Johnny Becker I worked with. Larry Lofton was the original director for aeronautics. Joe Chambers, we all know. Hanson, Engineer in Charge, is an excellent book. I have, if anybody's interested in these references, I can let you have a copy of those. And one last plug. I also have a copy of this that lists this website. If you go to the website, Mary Gaynor has a website, and I work with her on the 16-foot website. By the way, if you go to the mystery photograph for this past month, you'll see a pinned picture of me. No shirt.
Oh, that is you.
Go check out the mystery photograph. Now, I told you who it is, so you can't submit your entry. But if you're interested in some other stories, you can find about flying saucers over a 16-foot tunnel, man in the women's bathroom, a flying duck, a fan monster. These stories, if you go to this website, and you can get some additional interesting reading, I hope. So that's all I have. Any questions? I'll try to answer.
Is that website on your booklet, Bobby?
Is that website what?
Is that website listed in the booklet?
It is. It's inside the first, or although I'm too young to come in 1963, I think. I'm not sure about that. The picture you're looking at is probably one of the most utilized photographs in the NASA archives that's used on some book covers I'm aware of. One of the books is Engineer in Charge. I highly recommend that. It's an oxymoron now. It's on advertisements. They got AA magazine regularly carries that photograph, so that's the reason I selected that particular photograph. So hopefully this works. Here's an outline. What I plan on covering is the history of the physical plant. 3 periods from the time it was built up to the first major rehab, and then a middle period leading up to another major rehab, and then I'll cover some of the history of the work. Aeronautics, I've broken it in 3 groups. Aeronautics, and that's basically airplanes because space also includes aeronautics. But when I say aeronautics here, I'm talking about airplanes. Space, and then some of the technologies developed. So we'll first cover the first period when the tunnel was built to the first major rehab. Anybody want to take a guess how long it took to build the 16-foot tunnel?
2 years.
2 years.
10 months.
10 months. Optimistic 10 months. Okay. No, 16 foot was really built under clouds of war, so that's the title, the reason I have clouds of war there. Charles Lindbergh was on the NACA committee, and he took a trip to Germany building the 16-foot tunnel. So there's a connection to the top. All right, in 1939, the War Department grants land on the west side. Everything up to that point had been over on the east side of Langley Field to NACA. And in 1939, the funds for 16-foot high-speed tunnel was authorized. September 39, Germany invades Poland. And in June of 1940, the site for the 16-foot high-speed tunnel is prepared. So this is what they were going to build. It's an artist sketch up the top. Included 2 8,000 horsepower motors, a total of 16,000 horsepower. A round, solid test section, and an air exchange tower where about 20% of the air on each circuit around the tunnel would be scooped off the periphery and was exhausted straight out the top, and then fresh, cool air was brought in from the outside, and that served 2 purposes. One was to keep the tunnel cool, or cooler. We still would get the temperature on them sometimes. And the other reason was to scavenge exhaust gases off of these full-scale engines that they were going to run. And that feature remained a part of 16-foot tunnel for the rest of its life. So here in June 1940, they're starting site preparations for the tunnel. 3 months later, that's what it looked like. 7 months, you can see 2 ends of it in this aerial view. This is a structures lab. That was the first building on the west side of the building. 16-foot tunnel was the first wind tunnel facility.
He was the author of the 16-foot data reduction package, which anybody who's worked in wind tunnels knows that that's like the Bible for data reduction here at Langley. Conducted pioneering research that led to the development of several innovative exhaust nozzle concepts. Did research in yaw thrust vectoring nozzle concepts. He retired in 2005, but has remained active as a distinguished research associate at NASA, and then in 2008, he began working for ATK and AMA as a contractor in the Revolutionary Aviation Technologies branch. So, but I'm Bobby Berrier, and I'm a tunnel jockey, and I'm proud of it. I also have another title that I'm proud of.
after they decided to close the tunnel, 16-foot tunnel, and did close it, I mentioned that one of my supervisors said one of the, nicely say this, one of the things that really irritated me is having spent my life in that facility, I was not consulted on shutting it down. And they asked me, they said, you know why you weren't asked? I said, no, I don't. They said, because you're considered a tunnel holder. So that's another title that I'm proud of. I'm a tunnel hugging tunnel jockey. Courtney's right, I spent a lot of time 16-foot tunnel. While in Germany, he wrote a letter back to the NACA committee. And he said in that letter that he was incapable of conveying the extent of German aeronautical development in a letter. He just couldn't put it in a letter. He also said that Germany was far ahead of the United States in military aviation. 2 months later, 2 months, people that make decisions, 2 months, in December 1938, NACA recommended construction of new facilities at Langley Field in which special problems in military aircraft could be investigated. Those facilities were the Structures Lab, which was the first building on the west side of the field, a 20-foot tunnel to study spinning, a 7 by 10-foot high-speed tunnel to study stability and control problems, and a 16-foot diameter high-speed tunnel to study the cowling and cooling of full-scale engines and propellants. And 16-foot more or less has stayed true to that charter through its entire life, working propulsion. I used to get a lot of questions, why you guys work in propulsion? It comes from that original work. That committee also recommended a new center at Moffett Field in California, which we all know wound up being the Ames Research Center. I tried to connect this a little bit to the right before we lecture. This is a photograph of the 1938 National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Everybody's here except Lindbergh and Hap Arnold. Hap Arnold was on the committee. But the guy in the circle right there is Orville Wright. So he was in on the decision to recommend.
Branch, program manager on several major national programs, and an active participant in a large number of national and international committees. He authored or co-authored more than 80 technical publications. He has many awards and honors, include 15 major honors and awards, which include being named an AIAA Fellow in 1998, a few national or NASA Special Achievement Awards, a number of award-winning papers, some awards for his service to AIAA, and a NASA Exceptional Engineering Medal. He has a patent for a thrust augmented spin recovery device. Started his early career in the wind tunnels, where he assisted in the development of the Apollo launch escape system, which after he retired, he was asked to come back to talk to the CEV and CLV group to pass on his Apollo experience. He contributed significantly to the F-111 in low indoor exhaust nozzle performance and integration into the airframe. And he developed Langley's first air-powered twin-engine propulsion simulation capability. His research on the F-15 fighter led to modifications to the aft end, including removal of the ventral vanes, which reduced the cruise drag of the F-15 by about 7%. And